Okay, I guess as we're starting, any questions about anything we've covered so far or other stuff you need to know about or want to know about? Well, good. Okay. Um, if you notice, sort of, I somehow I forgot about when we were doing the other ones. I should have finished up with this. Here's the U.S. population pyramid. So if you remember the ones you were looking at last time, here's the American one. If you notice, it's not symmetrical in the way, sort of smooth sided like some of the other ones were. On the other hand, it's not nearly as bizarrely random as, say, the Russian one is. But one of the interesting aspects of this is if this is the US in totality, where'd that other one go? You have to remember one of the great things about population pyramids is you can look at it's a nice visual way to look at stuff. It's sort of subtle here, but if you look at this carefully, you can notice once you get in the above, when you get over the 60s, you notice that you start to see a fairly significant skewing between male and female. This is typical of a fair number of societies, but the United States is, a little I know of this, is the United States is pretty much an impressive example of this. You see a real variation between male and female mortality over the age of like 60. American men live about, I think it's almost like 6 years less than American women do, something like that. Which I think is about the same as it is in Japan. I don't know, I don't remember, you'd have to look. But you can actually see it. I mean, it's one thing to have the number, but it's actually, I think, more it's easier to consume when you actually see it in a visual like this, where it's sort of striking. Now, one of the other things that you can do when you look at these, and again, population pyramids are really sort of handy because they visually give you a whole mess of information depending on how you want to lay it out. And you could argue, and certainly we do as geographers, that one of the issues dealing with sort of the conservative, especially conservative Anglo-American movement in the United States and their increasing vocal, idea of what is American has to do with this. And this is actually a projection for the next 10 or 15 years about how the demographic patterns are changing the population period between non-Hispanic males. So this would be non-Hispanic males, non-Hispanic females. So that include African American, Asian American, anything outside of Hispanic here. And then the growth in the Hispanic proportion of the population. This is a real interesting one because if you go to the mainland, and I go to the mainland very rarely, but when I go back there, one of the interesting things is my family now lives in Oregon, which is, to be honest, has sort of been outside of the reservations, has been an area of pretty white privilege. And it's really interesting because that's an area they're having a really, really hard time handling the movement of Latinos populations into the state. It's a huge source of discussion when I go back and talk to folks. Yeah, when I walk down the street, I hear people speaking Spanish. And I mean, I grew up in a Mexican migrant neighborhood, so it's like, duh. That was in Southern California. So, but I mean, in some places like Oregon, they don't expect that. They expect that when you go to some place like, Arizona or maybe Texas, I mean, yeah, you're going to hear people speaking Spanish, but they don't think that's going to happen in Oregon. So what you find is the movement of Latinos populations outside of sort of the original areas of settlement has been a major, major demographic shift in the last 20 years. And in part is driving a lot of this very conservative, what was it, America for Americans First movements that you see with especially conservative groups. That what they're actually saying is they don't want anyone in the United States that isn't Anglo-American, either just by virtue of the way they look, or in many cases, even more so the way they quote behave and or speak. You can think of the number of times you see on Instagram or YouTube or something like that, someone dissing someone because they're not speaking English. That is much larger of an issue now than it was in the past. I think in part just because social media makes what would have been an issue between two people suddenly now becomes a national or global thing because someone put it on their phone and then the whole world sees it. Whereas before, just wanted someone being an ass in a store. But also it's because these issues have become much more central and mainstream in American society. Now, the weird thing, if you went back to in the United States, went back to the 1850s, 1860s, and if this was Anglo-American, and this was German-American or Scandinavian-American or Irish-American, it would sort of look the same and you'd see the same issues. So you can actually use population pyramids in the past and oftentimes make real interesting patterns when you're trying to figure out why were people behaving in certain ways or seeing certain things as issues? And from the standpoint of now, it's like, what was the problem? Population pyramids are oftentimes real handy for understanding why groups see the world in the way that they do. So on one hand, these are cumulative, they're entire populations, but they'll sometimes give you a fair amount of really interesting information in terms of how this relates to people's perceptions. Actually, let's go back to the original one here. Okay. Now, let's look at two societies that are, well, they're not really similar, but let's use this one first. Let's segue back here. So it's so hard to tell because I was too lazy to actually grab these things and so you could see them side by side. But this Japanese pyramid is a lot chunkier at the top than the American pyramid. There's a lot more old Japanese, like really, really, really old Japanese. And if you think about this right here would be the American retirement age. This is age 65. So everything above that, which is that 2, 4, 6, 7 categories up there, which is a huge part of the population, is folks in the United States would be retired. And of course, as I think I mentioned, in Japan, that would actually include everything from here on up. Now, what you find in Japanese society is because you don't have a lot of younger folks, relatively speaking. And if you guys had a chance to watch the videos, they'll hopefully sometime through this weekend, you'll realize this issue of aging in Japan is an enormous topic. It's an enormous topic outside of Japan. You see tons of documentary videos on the aging population in Japan, but it's also a major issue in the government. If you're running for office like Prime Minister in Japan, this is one of the things you have to talk about up front and center. All Japanese are very concerned about the aging population and how you're going to have to deal with them and what's the quality of life these people are going to have. And in this, you find all sorts of weird ramifications. And again, this is the relationship of population pyramid and demographics to people. And this is a good example. Okay. This is the Yumel doll. The Yumel doll was built on order of the Japanese Social Ministry, which is the Ministry of Health. It'd be the Ministry of Health and Behavioral Study or Behavioral something, or Behavioral Health, I think, in Japan. So this is one of the big ministries. This would be like the Department of Health at the US federal level. I don't have it turned on because this thing is too irritating. If it makes so much noise, your microphones will break out. But it was built between 2005 or 2006 and 2009. They were built by a company called Takara Tomy, which makes dolls. And they make robot dogs and stuff like that. But so they've been making these things, they've been making stuff like this for ages. But they never made anything that's sophisticated. This was actually designed by sociologists and especially psychologists, social psychologists in Japan, as a device for two groups. Now, one group specifically was the ladies in class, because in Japan, as I think I mentioned, one of the issues that you have in Japan is Japanese women aren't married, and they haven't been doing this for about 25, 30 years. So of these women that you see over on this side of this graph, actually, I guess we can stop the share. Let's see, bigger picture of this. When you see this particular, when you see the Yumel doll is a reflection of a particular concern in Japanese society. And one group, again, was you girls. The ladies in class in Japan, you're not married. Also, Japanese women over the ages of about 50 or 55 were what you call empty nesters. And especially women over the ages of 80 generally had survived and their husbands were dead. So you had these two populations they were very concerned about. Now, Japanese views of gender are really uniquely Japanese. And one of the main aspects of Japanese gender attitudes is that women, including you ladies in class, you can't actually be behaviorally fulfilled unless you have a kid. So you guys won't feel complete until you have a child. And in Japanese society, whereas in American society, it might be, some people want to have that, but in Japanese society, it's actually seen as a mental issue. So for the women in class, if you get to the age of 30 and you haven't had a kid, there's a very clear attitude in Japanese society that you guys are going to get messed up mentally. You're going to end up with behavioral issues because you don't have a kid. And because after about the age of 27 or 28, it's very hard to get married if you're a female in Japan. They call that the old wedding cake, is one of the slang slogans. So the government was they looked at that demographic trend, which you can see in that population pyramid, and they decided that they were going to have to do something about it. Now, they couldn't at gunpoint force women to get married. In fact, that was the whole problem. Women didn't want to marry Japanese guys and vice versa. So they had to come up with a surrogate or alternative. And this is the alternative. So this was built by a toy company, but it was built to a set of specs provided by the Japanese government. And these particular dolls were basically paid for by the Japanese government. I bought this at Takashimaya's in, I think, 2007. You have to have a passport or some sort of adult ID. You cannot buy one. You could not buy one of these if you're under age 18. So they were sold in Japanese department stores to adults only. Their kids are not allowed to own them. Now these are, it looks like a doll. If you ever come in the office once COVID dies down, they're very heavy. This thing weighs, I don't know, probably a couple of kilos. And that's intentional. Now, one of the things that's hard to see, and again, I'm not going to turn it on because it drives me nuts, is that this thing has an enormous number of sensors. It has heat sensors in it, it has motion sensors in it. It's actually designed to sleep with you and be with you 24/7, specifically sleep with you. Among other things, it keeps track of your sleeping patterns. So it'll actually, for example, if Emily's having a bad night sleeping, it'll actually, in the middle of the night, if she's not sleeping well, it'll actually sort of wake up and say, I'm scared, tell me a story. The next morning, it'll actually report on whether you were sleeping well or not, and why, and then ask you, why didn't you sleep well? Now you have to remember, this is pre-cell phone, this is pre-internet to a certain extent. So everything in this has over 2,000 phrases, but it's actually a standalone version of what you might get in a smartphone with apps, or a smartwatch with apps. So it's keeping track of your blood pressure, heart rates, all that type of stuff when you hold it. And so it's designed that you actually carry it around, and it monitors your physiological state, and also, from extrapolation, your behavioral state. Now, to Japanese, this was seen, to the government, this was seen as a very relatively low cost. These things cost about $300, $350 when they're new. You can still find them occasionally for sale on eBay, though they're really hard to find now. And they sold a ton of them. Eventually, in 2009 or something like that, the government quit the subsidy for the toy. And of course, the company quit making them because these things probably cost about $1,200 back in 2006 to make. So when you were paying one, you're only paying about 1/5 of the cost of the doll. So this was a government project to help women stay behaviorally stable if they weren't going to have a kid. Okay. So, it doesn't look like much, but it has sensors everywhere in the body. The eyes open and close, and it has this whole set of phrases, which is designed to get you engaged. It's what we call it an empathic social robot, to the idea of getting you engaged so that you feel comfortable with something. And they were very successful. You still find them if you go to Alibaba and stuff in Japan, or Amazon in Japan. These things resell for more than they probably originally cost. There's still a huge demand for these. In fact, I know there's 2 guys in Tokyo, one in Akihabara, not surprising, that actually repairs these for people. So by 2006 standards, these things are incredibly sophisticated. They're about 10 years ahead of their time, because the whole thing's within. There's no internet connection. There's no app running outside of the cloud. It's all based in the doll. So this was a Japanese government attempt to deal with the demographic patterns of the society. Now, why would this also be seen as useful for women over the ages of, say, 65 who don't have anyone living at home? I should point out these are also hugely popular in Taiwan and Hong Kong, though they only speak Japanese. 2 of my relatives in Hong Kong actually have these, which is how I originally found out about them. In the Japanese context or Asian context of, again, families are the most important thing, and one of the things that women really want to be is mothers with kids. What happens when the kids leave the house? Why is this considered a surrogate? And if it's freaky, don't worry, it's supposed to be freaky. Well, I'm not sure about that. What's the human supposed to do for an older lady?
Is this supposed to keep her company?
Yeah. If you want to, and I mean in a weird way, these things look really goofy. But if you think about older relatives and their dogs, their cats that they have, especially dogs, here in the United States, they dress them, they have names, they see them as members of the family. You know, to a certain extent, this is a more convenient version. You don't have to take it out for walks. You have to change the batteries, all you got to do. It actually tracks your behavioral, physiological states. So, I mean, in some ways, this is, because you have to remember that the dogs weren't seen even just 10 years ago. Dogs weren't seen the way they're seen now. The role of dogs in American society has changed dramatically in the last decade or decade and a half. And to a certain extent, this sort of was an indicator of that type of shift, where rather than depending on human companionship, you come up with something else that's more dependable. Because the Hummel doll doesn't work unless it's with you. The dog needs you. So these are both intentionally needy devices, except one's just robotic and one isn't. Now, why wouldn't these sell well in the United States? Assuming you got one that spoke English. We'll say that Peyton decides he's going to market these things in the United States. And he comes up with a, in 2009, he comes up with an English language speaking version of these. Why would they probably have not worked? Okay, for one group, are the women in class in your age group up to the age of 30 defined by having a kid? No, it's not. The American society doesn't see it that way. Secondly, is because pets are a very common commodity in the United States. There are always other ways to have a needy other than depending on a robot. But third would have to do with what Americans think of these things. We'll say that Kara is working in a store. So we'll say she's working at Whole Foods. And all of a sudden, ladies start to come in, 60-plus-year-old ladies start to come in carrying these things with them. And these things are talking and everything with them. Okay. What's the general kind of concept going to be of the folks in that store? Is this a normal thing you expect to see in American society, even here in Hawaii? No. Now, I should point out, in Japan, you still see these. If you go to tourist areas, especially resort areas like Arashiyama in Kyoto, you'll see these. You'll see people carrying these around. They actually, in some cases, they use little carriages. In most cases, they use in Japan, you tend to use a sort of like a carrier thing for a kid. And you'll see people walking around with these. And, in 2019, I haven't been back this year, but last year, you'd still see people carrying these around and going on vacation with their Hummel doll. And some little old lady that's about 1,000 years old, and she's got her Hummel doll with her. She's probably had it since, it was new when she was younger, and it's her companion. And no one in Japan thinks anything about it. No one takes pictures. No one does a giggle and a whistle or a poke and like, oh, look at that, or anything. They just doesn't even register. People just think, okay, whatever. So the view in the United States of things like robots is very, very different than the view of what robots can be in Japan. Okay. Now, the second, of course, is what has happened in the United States. This doesn't work near as well when we're doing this remotely, by the way. I might have a cat, but this doesn't seem like a real cat to me, but whatever. Now, this particular device started being built 4 years ago. It's built by Hasbro. They have a whole new section of Hasbro, which is a real famous game company. I think they might make Barbie dolls. I can't remember, whatever. They're the largest toy producer in the United States. They started up a new division back in, I think it was 2015, to build these. There's also a dog version, which we have in the office if you ever want to see them. These were actually intended, again, like their Japanese counterparts. These are intended only for adults. These cost about $100, so it's significantly cheaper. There's no government input. This one apparently really likes to be on Zoom. It doesn't usually make that much noise when it's in the classroom. So this particular thing is also a surrogate. It's trying to fall off my hand here. Come on, go back upright. Come on, back upright. There we go. So this particular thing was built for a specific population. They're still hugely popular. You see tons of them for sale on Amazon, QVC, all these type of places sell this thing. I don't think it's sold retail in stores. This is designed for folks in nursing homes. The fur is hypoallergenic. It has a mute function so that it does all the movements and it purrs, but it doesn't make any noise. So this was designed for adults. Now, the interesting thing is, on one hand, Americans have a real freak out attitude towards this. In part, I think, because they see it as being sort of a strange humanoid creature. The interesting thing is these have turned out to be enormously popular. Hasbro actually sold the division or bought it back because it was making so much money they wanted to keep it in store or in company. They're now coming up with the second generation of these things apparently. When these first came out, my sister actually works in a nursing home in Oregon. So I actually bought 2 and sent them to the nursing home because we were curious to see if it actually worked. That nursing home, which has about 60 residents, now has 7 of these. There was the 2 that we got them, which became hugely popular, and then people are actually buying them for their parents in the nursing home. One lady a couple of months ago was buried with hers when she passed away. She actually had in her will that she wanted to be buried with her cat. I pointed out to my sister, I hope they turned the batteries off, otherwise some poor guy in the graveyard is going to absolutely freak out at some point. Also, this thing starts meowing from 6 feet under near a tombstone or something. It'd be very Halloween if you think about it. Or also the cat comes out of the ground and all sorts of cool stuff. So the interesting thing is these have turned out to be very popular in the United States. They were intended specifically for folks in nursing home that couldn't have actual animals around, because either they're allergic to animals or contagion, fear of contagion, etc. The interesting thing is now the largest market in this thing, not surprisingly, why has the growth in sales in these things gone absolutely sky high during COVID?
Because we're lonely.
Yeah, we're lonely. You might want an animal, but if, for example, in a lot of apartments in Honolulu, you can't have an animal. In a lot of other areas, you can. If you're in a dorm, you can't have an animal. So what you find is a lot of folks in the situation they're in want to have something, but don't have the ability or don't have the social network to make it happen. And that's what these things sort of replace. So it's one of the interesting patterns. Demographically, this was intended for the top part of that pyramid in a very specific marketed way. But what you find is as other populations, as we become more isolated, things like this are becoming more and more common. There's a new dog that just showed up that's going to go on sale, I think, next month. That's about $300, which is creepy because that one looks totally realistic. These intentionally don't, which is sort of interesting. Hasbro did a very cost-conscious move. People think of this as being a real fake-looking cat, but the interesting thing is you have it sitting in a classroom and people are talking around it. After a couple of minutes, you find people start petting it and stuff like that. They sort of forget that it's a toy. There's a whole set of studies done on what we call parasocial, where we can make things into something else than what they actually are because we want it to be something else. So both of these are actually part of the reflection of the idea of what you have when you have these patterns of demographic change. Now, in societies where a large part of the population is young, these things aren't going to be of particular interest. Though I should point out that my nieces, who are now 10, have 2 of the dog. We had one of the family dinners, we actually took the cat and the dog just to show the family what research we were up to. Since for a while I was involved in a project where we're actually going to build some of these. And the nieces love the dog so much, and they're not allowed to have animals. Typically in Chinese families, you're not allowed to have animals. Chinese aren't big on pets at home. So they've now had 1, and then the twin wanted her own. Now they have 2. They've had them now for almost 3 years, and they still sleep with them. They still interact with them all the time. They know that they're not pets. They know that they're not a real dog, but they do feel that having that's a lot better than having nothing. So it's sort of interesting, even in modern American society, as we become more individualized and isolated, these serve a particular function. And one interesting aspect is, unlike Japanese society, where the Yumel doll is designed for behavioral situations, one of the main reasons that these turn out to be popular, and certainly it's true in my sister's case when she talks to the folks that have these, is the reason that they like having this is because in the old folks' home in the United States, their family doesn't visit. And the mainland family rarely visits. Most folks there see their family maybe once a month, even pre-COVID or during holidays. So for the other, maybe 350 days of the year, they're by themselves with other folks in the home. So they don't have anything with a close emotional connection that they can think of as their own. So in Japanese society, you have the stereotype of gender and gender roles and behavior. In the United States, what you have is the concept of individualism and being alone. So you end up with very different empathic social robots, but they end up serving somewhat different purposes, but in some cases are sort of similar. Interestingly enough, I just checked with Hasbro a couple of months ago, and these don't sell at all well in Japan. Japanese love cats, and they love dogs, but they won't buy these. They don't, somehow these just don't relate to Japanese. There's other dogs and cats, including the famous Sony Aibo, which do sell well in Japan, but these don't for some reason. The Japanese just don't see a relationship with them. On the other hand, there's been a lot of pressure on Takara Tomy to rebuild, start coming up with new versions of the Yuma doll. So Japanese want humanoid friends. Americans want animal-like friends. So if everyone was sitting behind me, I guess you guys had to see it. That's usually what's back there. Okay, so let's go back. Whoops. Okay, so let's finish up all this stuff with populations, looking at the last sort of concepts. I want to do that. Let me do this at the same time. Yeah, okay, I'll sort of work. Okay, sorry, I just need to fish something up. Okay, the last set of concepts, again, are sort of tied into what we were looking at last time. These are the two major measures that we use when we're actually looking at change. One of the classic examples right now would be Indian society. India is now the most rapidly growing population in the world. They're going to surpass China in total population, I believe, by 2025, if not earlier. So what you're looking at with these are actually the two really useful numbers when you're looking at population patterns globally, is what we call TFR and ZPG. For the planet as a global entity, and also, sustainability in terms of food, et cetera, et cetera. What you're frequently looking at is what we call ZPG, which means that you're talking about zero population growth. And that's what I was mentioning before. Zero population growth for most places would be like 2.1, 2.2, 2.3%, which means that over time, your population is stable. It's not going up, it's not going down. It's just you've got basically what we call replacement rates. So, 100 years from now, if the United States was ZPG, the number of people in the United States 100 years from now would be exactly the same as the population now, or almost exactly the same. That's generally the goal for some societies, especially in the more developed like Europe, the United States, et cetera. Now, having said that, none of those societies is doing that. Korean population is declining rapidly. Japanese population, the bottom's falling out of it. Italy, Greece, England and France a little less so. Germany, the population is falling apart. So most of your, sort of first tier, highly successful countries economically are nowhere near ZPG. They're actually falling off the end of that. They can't even get up to ZPG. The other way that you tend to look at this is sort of a strange number, but it's a really useful one. This is what we call total fertility rate. And what you're looking at, this again, is one of these statistical analyses, but what you're actually looking at is for each 1,000 women or 10,000 women, or whatever number you want to use in a particular society, how many children do they have? And this TFR gives you a good sense of what the total population patterns are. In other words, how many children does a woman have when she's bearing children in her lifespan? In Italy, I believe it's 1.3 or something like that. So it's staggering little. Again, you're not even getting replacement rates. Some of your fastest growing are parts of East Africa, but also Samoa, your Polynesian region, especially Samoa and Tonga. It's about 5 or 6. So what you get is every woman in her lifespan will have 3, 4, 5, or 6 or more children statistically. Now what that means is you end up with a massive increase in populations in relatively short periods of time. So TFR is a real handy read when you're looking at one society versus another society, or one place and another place in terms of the patterns of sort of the demographic patterns. It's a real handy model. It's the number that's usually used by the United Nations and other groups when they're talking about population, global population issues. It will be TFR and maybe ZPGs. So you'll see those a lot. The last two of these, the last sort of 2.5, has to do with the whole issue of tied to sort of environmental, social environmental conditions. The first of these is a guy named Malthus, and to be honest, I can never remember where Malthus came from in terms of where. It's obviously, I'd say German or Austrian, but I don't remember exactly when he else shows up. But his proposal was very simple. Let's see, let's flip over here. He basically said that in a particular species, so I believe he was originally a biologist, that would make sense. If you end up with a situation where there's relatively unlimited resources, like for example, lots of food, the standard thought prior to him was that in a particular species, the species will sort of grow in a linear pattern, like this. Because as the population, if the food, for example, was your constraining factor, and now the food's not a constraining factor, the population will slowly increase to take advantage of the fact there's more food available. Malthus said that's not the case. Malthus actually argued that what you would rather see is what's called a classic sort of growth and crash curve. He said that what would happen is the population would exponentially expand to consume that food. And then at some point, what you'd end up is the population would get to the point where it actually was consuming more than existed. And at that point, the population would crash. Now, in the grimmest version of his theory, he said that population might actually go extinct. So the population might eat itself out of existence. Now, this is all largely hypothetical, but in the 19th century, here in the Pacific, actually in what's now the Leeward Islands, the western parts of Hawaii, near Midway, there was one of the small sand islands there near Midway that ships were always crashing on. So, and people were literally, there were cases of ships crashing there and people cannibalizing each other to survive till they get rescued. So it was these rather horrific episodes. So what they did is they came up with the idea of taking rabbits out to one of these islands, since it had grass on it, and leaving the rabbits there with the idea that they would provide emergency food the next time a ship crashed ashore there. And so they did this with the best of intents, and there wasn't much concern about it because it was a very small piece of real estate. They just sort of thought, given this type of thing, that the rabbits will slowly increase, and it will be there the next time people need it as like emergency food. What happened is when a ship happened to pass by not too long later, the island is basically covered in rabbits. And then when a ship went by, I believe about 10 years later, there were no rabbits, but there were a bunch of rabbit skeletons. And so there were other couple of cases where there were introduced species on an island, but they had no ability to escape. So it was a very small piece of real estate. So they're actually able to see over time that what you end up with what looked like Malthus's model, that the rabbits exponentially increased their population to eat the grasses till they literally ran out of grass and the whole population died. That particular island still has no grass and has no rabbits. And this is a whole 100 years later. So from these early accounts in the 19th century, these sort of accidental accounts, it looked like there might be some truth in Malthus. If you go to YouTube and type in Malthus, this might show up. There was an actually grim study, which I saw you never want to do this. I saw this originally, I think like 8 o'clock in the morning in a huge intro class in anthro. And there was a study done at, I believe, one of the universities back east, where they actually took a huge, plastic or plexiglass cage, and they put 2 rats in it. And what they did is they set up so that it's big, about the size of my office, so I mean a really large cage. And they made sure that there was always enough food, enough water for the rats. And at that point, they just left them alone. They just always made sure there was enough. Every day they would just put food and water in. And what happened, and they did a time lapse, so you actually watch this in black and white film, and it's a good way to end up with a nightmare for at least a couple of weeks, is the rats start to exponentially increase. So first you have, a pair of rats, and pretty soon you got 10 rats, and pretty soon 100 rats. Very quickly, the whole box is just covered in rats. Then what's really weird, and this is the part that was absolutely fascinating to the psychologists that were doing the original study, was as the rats start to kill each other. Now remember, there's always enough food and water. So no matter how many rats were there, they're never going to starve to death. But what you find is the rats start to murder each other. They commit homicide. The rats start to engage very heavily in what you might call sort of deviant sexual behavior, which rats don't do. In other words, the rats start to hang around with folks like them rather than the other gender of rats. There was a huge number of cases where rats were killing the young, in some cases eating their own young. But again, there was no reason to eat them because there was no shortage of food. So this was all behavioral responses to massive overcrowding. And eventually, when they ended the project, there were no rats left. The last group of rats just quit eating, just died. They committed suicide. It was all in the space of a very short thing, but they originally condensed this down to a black and white, about 12-minute video, which again is one of the creepiest things I have ever seen. So I strongly recommend, if you want to scare the crap out of yourself, watch it. If you don't want to scare the crap out of yourself, then just send it to someone you don't like and let them watch it for you. But what that suggested from this 1950 study is Malthus was totally accurate. The rats could have stopped making as many babies. The rats didn't have to engage in deviant or literally homicidal behavior. But at some point they did. And they did this despite the fact that food and water were never an issue. This has sort of become the baseline study for this whole discussion, that there was more truth to Malthus than we'd like to think. The general assumption outside of this is that species tend to be pretty rational and pragmatic about the way they use their world around them, and will control their growth to deal with the social and behavioral and environmental implications. Malthus basically said that was crap. That's not true. That if you give species resources, they will literally expand until they blow the whole thing apart, and then it's sort of like, oh no, and then plunk, the whole thing collapses. So Malthus is incredibly important when you deal with environmental issues. Because it implies that there is no such thing as environmental control within a species. Environmental controls are only based on external constraints. Because rats are very social animals, rats don't kill other rats. Rats, that's one reason I use them for test subjects all the time. Rats don't mind being in confined spaces. There's nothing that would explain why the rats did what they did or behaved what they did, except the conditions they put themselves into. And that's why the Malthus thing is pretty scary, because rats are not stupid. They're very smart animals. And if they would do that, then pretty much it means that all bets are off for anything else. So Malthus is hugely important because when you're looking at, for example, human populations on the planet, human populations in various areas, the idea of environmental education, Malthus sort of says that none of that's going to work. That you pretty much have to have some sort of set of constraints in place. Otherwise, sooner or later, your population's going to do this till it basically collapses itself. And sad to say, the history of human societies is that there's a fair amount of evidence to show that, at least in part, Malthus was sort of probably not exactly wrong. The most famous probably being Rapa Nui, which is oftentimes called Easter Island here in Polynesia. It's sort of a case in point in some ways of this. So Malthus is important to understand because on one hand, it's a very uncomfortable model to think of. On the other hand, at least the evidence to date in many species shows that it's at least a viable argument and possibly a legitimately structural model in terms of dealing with a lack of environmental constraints. Okay, this last one of these. Okay. This gets us back to something. Now, I don't know, it's always confusing to me what you guys get in like high school. So if you go back in ancient history when you guys were in high school, do you guys have courses in like environmental science that you normally take versus maybe as an elective? Because I know they don't do it at like St. Louis and stuff, but I have no idea whether schools here are the norm. Okay, all I'm getting is either blank looks or people shaking.
For my school, it was like those types of classes were like electives. They weren't required.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, because I've always been sort of curious, and we're working with St. Louis right now, what science classes do you have to take in high school?
For my school, what was required was biology and chemistry. And then everything else we'd take would be for like AP classes or whatnot.
Is that, I see other people, is that true? I see one other person nodding. Is that sort of the norm? Huh.
Yeah, it was like mostly like freshman, sophomore year is like biology, chemistry, and then like junior, senior, you get to choose whether or not you wanted to continue.
Wow. Why? I can see biology, but why would chemistry be one of the two? Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I'm asking wrong. You guys had to suffer through it. You aren't in charge of the school curriculum. So, okay, sorry. I withdraw that question. That's, okay. That's interesting. Okay, good. Thank you. That's good to know. I didn't know that. Okay, so that explains it. This might not be familiar then. Do any of you know what well, we'll just do it with virtual show of hands or fingers or whatever. Do you guys know what homeostasis means? Okay, I got one person yes, one person 50%, two yes, 150%. Everyone else is sort of going like, what? Okay. Homeostasis means steady state. So homeostasis, and the thing about homeostasis is it's over time. Homeostasis means that over a period of time, things will remain the same as they were before, and they're supposed to extrapolate into the future the same. Homeostasis is really important when you're looking at Euro-American attitudes, because in the Western intellectual tradition, especially in the United States, there's a very strong attitude of homeostasis, that every week things should be like they were the week before, unless, for example, someone decides they want to make a change. So, for example, there's one reason I think behaviorally, especially in the United States, people have had a terribly hard time with the COVID issue, because it's totally messed up the idea of the same thing. School's not the same thing, work's not the same thing, nothing's the same thing. Now, in other societies where they don't have homeostasis, so for example, in Asia, homeostasis is not logic. If you're in China, Chinese do not have that concept at all. They don't expect this week to be the same as last week. So they've dealt with COVID very differently, because they don't have this idea that, well, this isn't fair. This week's not the same as last week. That's not fair somehow. So homeostasis from a behavioral standpoint is really important. But most importantly, what it also means is we tend to look at the world around us in terms of change as being a crisis, in the sense that change is something that's different, and difference that's uncontrolled is by definition automatically bad. And again, that's out of the Western intellectual tradition, where homeostasis is sort of the goal. Having said that, if you think about it, even in your parents' generation, homeostasis was not the situation. In fact, you argue for human existence, homeostasis never actually existed. We were always in a position of change. Now, this also ties in this idea of carrying capacity. Now, I assume that everyone that voted yes on homeostasis can also vote yes on carrying capacity. Okay, that seems to be more equivocal about that. Okay. Carrying capacity is the number of a particular species that exists in a very specific space. So it's based on a geographical concept. The geographical concept is a bounded area. So carrying capacity is actually the population of that species that can exist through time in that particular bounded space. Now, if you look at that, for example, if you look at this campus, if this was a regular school year, there'd be a ton of mongooses running around campus. My guess is there's probably going to be between 30 and 60 mongooses on the Chaminade St. Louis campus. Okay. Now, the actual carrying capacity for that species on this campus is probably about 5. If Madison does a study and finds out that there's 60 mongooses on the campus, but the actual carrying capacity for this particular environment is 5, how the hell do you explain the other 55 mongooses? And I'll give you a hint. It has to do with what happens here 9 months of the year. What's on campus except in the summer?
Students.
Students, especially you guys, and especially St. Louis students. And especially St. Louis students, since they seem to be really bad at this, they don't eat all the food they buy. So they toss stuff away in the garbage cans. And guess where you find the mongoose? They're recycling the stuff you guys don't eat. Okay. So to a certain extent, people are feeding mongooses here. Yeah, mongooses. So that's where you get the other 55 from. Now, one of the things you'll notice is when everyone leaves in May, is what are you going to see by June on campus, really visible that you didn't see normally? Because all of a sudden, all you guys are gone. The St. Louis students are all gone. What do you see running around campus desperately looking for food? Those same mongooses. Because now that carrying capacity has been modified. So the carrying capacity is artificial. The presence of students and folks on campus throwing food away basically was feeding a larger population. But the minute that external stimulus is dropped, the actual carrying capacity goes down to whatever birds or other things the mongooses eat that exist in this environment are around. And that's not very many. So when you look at carrying capacity is based on a long-term pattern of equilibrium. How much of a species can exist in an environment with existing factors. Now, if you look at this particular island, given what we've done to it in the last 200 years, the carrying capacity for people on the island of Oahu is probably about 35 to 40,000. Now, the population of the island of Oahu right now is about 930,000. Now, given that, what can you say about the human population here in terms of carrying capacity? We're like the mongoose. We import 97% of our food. We live in an entirely artificial world that's not based on local food production. So when the government's talking about sustainability, as the state's really big on that, that's never going to happen. The population of the Hawaiian Islands, even at the peak when all the land was available for food, for example, Palolo Valley was food production. People didn't live there. So, you know, this island, for example, almost none of the food production space is still available. It's all residences and businesses and stuff. So it's gone. The population of this island is maybe 80,000. Now it would probably be 7,000 maximum if you had to live on the world that we've made this into. So when they're talking about sustainability, it's impossible. We can't have a 1 million person sustainable population with the conditions here. You know, we only have that because stuff comes in from outside. So if something gets in the way of that, then all of a sudden all bets are off. That's one of the really sort of chilling factors is the artificial nature of human use of the landscape. There's almost an entire ignorance of what actual carrying capacity is until something happens. For example, if a hurricane hits and all of a sudden there's no shipping coming in, the power drops off, then you very quickly all of a sudden get a look at what the carrying capacity of a place is. And that's usually when you see people in a total panic because everything's disappeared. So like the mongooses, we're dependent on an artificial construct. So when you're looking at carrying capacity, it's a hugely important concept because all the discussion dealing with environmental issues at some point, you have to actually figure out what's the actual carrying capacity for a particular species in a particular space. Then you have to define what that spatial boundary is. So carrying capacity is always defined in terms of geographic concepts. It's always a spatial thing. It's never an abstract. It's always based on some parameter of area. The last of these is, of course, the classic example right now. This is what we call disease vectors. Now you see a lot of this. The whole COVID thing at some point is, a couple of years from now, someone finally collects all the data. This is going to be a classic example of disease vectors. And this has to do with the fact that when you look at populations moving, in fact, let me send you this out. When you look at populations moving, diseases tend to occur in particular locations, and especially viruses, because they tend to be in areas where viruses are prone to heavy mutation patterns in some way, in shape and form. They're oftentimes very symbiotic with human species or related species, and therefore what happens is that virus modifies itself, moves into a new set of human hosts, and off you go. Ebola in Northern Africa would be a good case in point. The SARS back in 06 or 07 or what is it, 2003 would be another case in point. Now, if you think of the most famous of these that people still remember for some weird reason would be the Black Plague back in the, I think, 1300s or something like that, in much of the Euro-Asian part of the planet. And there's actually even back given how bad records were, we actually know the process by which it moved, because in a lot of places like Italy, they actually had records of a particular ship coming to a particular port. One or two of the guys are sick, and all of a sudden everyone in the city gets sick. The most famous of these in terms of documentation, though, again, the documentation is not as good as it should be. What oftentimes is called the 1918 Spanish flu, which was by far the most dramatically high mortality rate. Estimates of the mortality rate from roughly 25 to 50 million people died between 1917 and 1920 from the Spanish flu. Many more than died in World War I, which was just ending at that time. The interesting thing is that moved a lot faster. Now, if you're thinking about technology, what's the difference in technology between, say, 1500 if you're Christopher Columbus, and if it's 1900 in terms of getting from, say, Europe to the United States? If you're Christopher Columbus in 1492 or whatever the hell he was wandering around, and you're sailing from Spain to the United States, and you have a virus that has a gestation period of 6 days. What can you tell me by the time that sailing boat reaches North America?
There's going to be a lot of people dead.
Yeah, pretty much it will have run its course before they get ashore, because that's a self-contained system. So in some ironic ways, if it's a fairly fast-moving virus, and you're exactly right, there's all sorts of historical accounts of literally dead man ships because they were slow-moving. They only went about 3 miles an hour. Now, if you suddenly fast forward to 1918, and your average speeds of ships, they're steamships, and they're going 18 miles an hour, so you can get from Europe to the United States in 3 or 4 days. And the Spanish flu, which is very closely related to the COVID, they're very closely tied varieties of the same type of virus. So its gestation period is about 6 or 7 days. What's the scary thing about that if it only takes 4 days to get from the United States to Europe? That ship lands in London. What don't you know when those folks get off the ship?
If they still have the flu.
Yeah, you don't know how many have it, how bad it is, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you suddenly segue into 2020 or 2019, and your average length to get from, say, Hong Kong to LA is 9 hours, what can you tell me about the problem of gestation period? If I come from Hong Kong and I actually caught COVID in Hong Kong, and I fly to LA because I've got business meetings there, and then I'm going to go visit friends in Seattle or something like that, and we'll say that it takes 72 hours for it to actually show up, and I caught it just as I was leaving. What's the problem going to be when Kayla's trying to track me later? When will I finally show symptoms of it?
Like when it's too late?
Yeah, 3 days later, and I might have been at 8 airports. I might have been in 10 or 12 different places. And in each airport, since I was already carrying it, I might be dispensing it. So you've got every plane that I sat in, every airport bus that I was in, every airport terminal I was at, every place that I had food, all those places will be subject to me spreading that particular disease. But because the amount of time, the transit time is so short, there's going to be an enormous amount of time for me to do that. I'm not doing it intentionally. I don't know that I've done anything. I feel perfectly normal. That's the huge problem they've had with COVID, is because the transit times are so short now versus what they were 400 or 500 years ago. 400 or 500 years ago, COVID would have remained a local virus infection, probably in part of China or wherever it started. Okay. By the early 20th century, with faster movement times, COVID could spread, but it was a little slower. We know the Spanish flu took about 9 months to spread around the planet, and that sort of makes sense. 6 or 7 days, 4 or 5 days, spreading around, and it happened. COVID moved in weeks, okay? Because it moves from Asia to Europe in the space of 2 weeks. It moves from Asia to the United States in the space of 3 weeks, it looks like now. And because airplane flights are so short, it then immediately disperses to all other places. So for example, say it again, that I'm flying from Hong Kong to LA. I'm taking another commuter flight up to Seattle. I then have to go check some work that we're doing, say, in New York. And then I'm going to be flying to Tokyo to deal with a conference, and I'm going to come back to Honolulu. Now, all of that might very well happen before I start to actually manifest symptoms. But it means if Peyton or someone else is actually tracking if they're doing classic what they call COVID tracking, he's going to be there for 1,000,000 years. Because I might have interacted with over 100,000 people in that period of time, in the sense that they're sharing the same space and sharing the same air as I was. So what would have been restricted spatially, or 100 years ago would have been, you could actually follow the footprints of it once you know what to look for. Now, it just sort of is what it is, which is one of the reasons why the World Health Organization is sort of like, this thing is moving around and it's going to take the time it's going to take, because there's not really any way to control it. You can map its progress to a certain extent, but even then you're not going to know, because, not even including asymptomatic people which show no symptoms, but even if everyone did show symptoms, there's still the time lag between it basically acquiring it and showing the symptoms, which is one reason why the temperature checks are useless for all intents and purposes. That's too late, because if that person has temperature rise, that's already 3, 4, 5 days into the cycle. So this is a huge part of what geographers do. If you ever look at the models that WHO or someone else puts out there with mapping the trend and patterns and where the disease is showing up, how much of in a particular case, how the patterns have changed over the last 6 months and stuff like that, that's all geographers doing that work. We're the ones that map diseases. We're the ones that map things like COVID. And we're the ones that also make predictive models where COVID's going to show up next or where it's going to pop back up again. And this is the whole issue of cycling, that COVID's going to go in waves. Which is what the World Health Organization has pointed out from the beginning, because with the ease of movement for much of the planet and the very short periods of time people are talking about, in total innocence, you can go from one place to the next and have no idea that you're carrying something until it becomes way too late to know about it. So, this is something that's weighing on the state right now as they're talking about reopening tourism. You don't know what you're getting yourself into until you do it. This is why a lot of places like South Korea and stuff have been very cautious about tourism, because they're very aware of these patterns. So for example, South Korea and Japan and Hong Kong just signed an agreement that Japanese and South Korean tourists can go to Hong Kong and vice versa. What can you tell me statistically about disease vector models for those 3 places? Why are you allowed to go between them now? Why wouldn't they include Hawaii? In fact, if you're from Hawaii, I don't think you're allowed anywhere in the world. So sorry, if you're planning on going somewhere, you're not going to be able to go there. They've only had, I believe, 180 cases in Tokyo in the last 2 weeks. Now, Tokyo is 27 million people. Okay. South Korea, I believe they had 6 cases this last week. South Korea is, I believe, 42 or something million people. Hong Kong had 18 cases. They actually tested a whole quarter of the population this last week. They tested over 600,000 people in a week. They had 18 cases show up, and that's in a population of 12 million people. So why are they comfortable with allowing tourists to go between Japan, South Korea, and Hong Kong?
Because they're able to maintain the virus.
Exactly.
Unlike us.
Why won't they include anyone else in that pattern?
They probably don't trust them.
Yeah, and they either don't trust them in the sense that they aren't telling the truth, but in most cases they just don't trust them because they figured that place really doesn't know how many people have it, so they don't know exactly what the statistical proportion is, so they don't know what the risk factor is. So when you're looking at disease vectors, they've always been a big issue if you're in epidemiology or something like that. The geographers are heavily involved in if a health geographer. But especially nowadays in this particular year and the worst situation we find ourselves in, this has all of a sudden become a major political decision. As of 2 weeks ago, Germany suddenly shut down travel with the rest of Europe because all of a sudden in France and in England and 2 other countries, bang, they had a major increase in COVID cases that showed up out of nowhere. And it turns out they showed up because they had come up there from Spain. And the Spanish apparently were either not tracking people sufficiently well enough or didn't have enough statistics. Something went wrong. And so now those countries now shut their borders with Spain. Now, in both cases, they've had this off and on again. So this is like their 3rd or 4th wave. So what you're getting more and more is places are getting very, very parochial. You saw this with the first COVID outbreak here, the attitude that rather naively they had, if they didn't let anyone in, then somehow COVID wasn't going to be an issue here. but that was based without any stats. So it was based on optimistic optimistic reasoning, but it wasn't a disease vector model, which is something that the guys at UH were pointing out to him at the time. They were making assumptions based on no data, just wishful thinking. So, in Hong Kong's case, they're the only ones that I know that have done this. They have done this in China and cities, but Hong Kong actually had 600,000 people tested in less than a week, just so they could actually get data on what the actual disease vector population pattern was for the entire city of Hong Kong, which is one of the most dense urban populations in the world. In fact, it is the most dense urban population. They're talking about they're doing the same thing in South Korea and Seoul. They're talking about the next couple of weeks actually trying to test, I believe, 1 million people in less than a week. And Tokyo is talking about this, but right now the numbers drop, so I'm not sure they're going to actually do this. But in all cases, what they're trying to do is actually get a model for the pattern of disease patterns, because then if you know how much of a disease you have, you can actually predict the vectors and the movements of that disease and what your consequences are going to be if you let folks in from point A into your population. Which, sad to say, if you look at it, we're not doing that here in Hawaii. And the whole idea of tourism coming in is not based on a statistical geographic model. It's based on, we need to have jobs start up. Yeah. So one of the sort of creepy aspects of this particular discussion in a geography class is that it's about as relevant as you can possibly get, because it literally is the world we live in September 2020. So book has a fairly good discussion of some of this, though it's based on the older ones. I'm going to send you a pretty good, not super creepy video on the 1918 flu. I'm not interested in watching it in terms of, in fact, the one I'm going to send you is actually really good, because what he's talking about is the movement of the flu. There's a ton of videos on the 1918 flu. Most of them are actually really bad. And one of the reasons is very simple. We don't know how many people died. It was the last year of World War I. Many governments, including the American government, thought it would be a morale crush if you actually said this. So for example, we know on an island off of New York, off of Manhattan, there's an island there, it's called Dead Man's Island. They actually dug mass graves, and we know they buried at least 50,000 people there in less than a week. We do not know who they were. We know nothing about them. The health records were eradicated for security reasons in World War I. So no one knows how many Americans died because of the flu in 1918, because the government didn't want to release it. And after that, it was considered high security. And after that, they intentionally lost the records. We're sort of sure how many died here in Honolulu vaguely. But for much of the mainland United States, especially the urban areas, no one knows and no one will ever know. Until, for example, in one case in Chicago, they actually bumped into a mass grave with over 4,000 people in it that they realized must have been from that, but there are no records. They'd just been buried, and then the whole thing was hidden. So all people knew is their relatives vanished. That's the last they heard of them. And that was very typical of much of Europe also. So I mean, the really surrealistic aspect of that particular disease vector was that's why we don't know how many people died, because governments didn't even report to their own people how many people were dying from it. So that particular video is really good because it's looking at the movement of it and how that's a result of that. But when you're watching it, think about comparing it to the existing COVID issue and the fact that movement and the ease of travel is so much greater now than it was 100 years ago, 120 years ago. It's sort of really has sort of implications, because as WHO points out all the time, this is just the first. There's going to be a lot more COVIDs out there. In fact, it was sort of surprising it waited this long. There's a bunch of different viruses out there that are equally communicable. They just haven't hopped to people in the same way, and they haven't found a way to distribute themselves. So this is, this to some extent, this is going to be the new norm. So, anyways, okay. Any questions about all that, since that now finishes off this chunk? We all good? Okay. Again, I'll send you out that video link for that. So just watch it for information. I don't think there's any reason to do a reaction for it.